Now, before the vote to eliminate net neutrality, there were a lot of anti-net neutrality pieces that came out in conservative publications. Now, these publications, of course, one of them was Daily Caller, the other is Wall Street Journal, anywhere where they could write conservative propaganda that's in favor of the corporations, they're going to publish. Now, what's interesting is that doesn't match what we know about the conservative base, who's actually massively in favor of net neutrality regulations. I know, right? Republican voters are in favor of regulations by a margin of 75%. 75% of Republicans are in favor of net neutrality. This is an issue that goes far beyond partisanship, at least when it comes to the voters. Now, speaking of these op-eds, there was one in the Wall Street Journal. There's actually one in Wall Street Journal today, written by the editorial board. But I want to talk about one of the ones that was yesterday because I think it's important to know where it's actually coming from. So yesterday, the Wall Street Journal featured an op-ed that essentially dismissed the net neutrality repeal as, hey man, no big deal. Oh, nothing's going to change. Everything's going to be fine. You libs, you're just triggered, okay? Don't worry. The free market's going to correct itself. It's going to work just fine. In fact, I have to note that this morning's op-ed argued essentially the same thing. Now, the Wall Street Journal's editorial board wrote that Mr. Pai's rules would require that broadband providers disclose discriminatory practices. Thus, cable companies would have to be transparent if they throttle content when users reach a data cap, or if they speed up live sports programming, or they don't mention slow other people down. They add that, quote, consumers can choose broadband providers and plans accordingly. See, look at that. You're going to have choices. The free market, the invisible hand is going to come in and it's going to say, no cable company, you are not going to slow down because you're going to lose customers. But wait a minute. There's a problem there. That argument's bullshit. See, in a lot of places, unfortunately, we have regional monopolies. So you have one cable company, one ISP that controls an enormous amount of area. And a lot of places, that's your only avenue to access broadband. So you either play by their rules or you get stuck with 56K or you get stuck with something that is automatically slower or no option at all. So what are you going to do for internet, right? So that means that you don't have choice, okay? Because there is no competition in these areas thanks to these regional monopolies. There is no free market that is going to correct itself. So that argument, of course, is completely disingenuous, and they fucking know it. Now, these op-eds that are in favor of eliminating net neutrality, again, you're not going to be surprised that they're not written by regular people or voters or people that are going to be affected by net neutrality. No. It's actually written by lawyers and lobbyists for the telecom industry. Shock. Horror. Now, one such lawyer was President Barack Obama's former FTC Commissioner Chief, John Leibowitz. Now, he wrote this article, this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, that celebrated the fact that the FTC would get restored authority to, in his words, aggressively police the internet for anti-competitive or unfair conduct. Well, it wouldn't be nice, but as I'm going to explain, that's actually not what the FTC is going to be able to do. It turns out their authority in regulating ISPs for this kind of, the slowing down, throttling, blocking sites is actually very limited. According to The Intercept, his op-ed also contained an unusual disclaimer, and I'm going to explain that. Mr. Leibowitz was a Democratic commissioner at the FTC from 2004 to 2013, and chairman beginning in 2009. As a partner at the law firm Davis Polk and Wardwell, he represents both technology companies and broadband providers. So that's that is the disclaimer, right? So there's a couple of ideas why he would do that, right? So maybe he's saying, look, I've worked for both sides. I'm being completely impartial, and look at me being super impartial, and I think net neutrality is stupid. I'm not a broadband industry shill. Look, I've got interests on both sides. And I still hate net neutrality. Now, I think that is an effort to manufacture consent by saying, oh, look, here's a guy who's worked for both. He doesn't have any financial interests in eliminating net neutrality. So we can believe his word when he tells us that repealing net neutrality is no big deal. So again, his law firm has worked on behalf of both tech companies, which were opposed to, of course, removing the net neutrality rules. In fact, Netflix came out and said that we're incredibly disheartened and we're actually going to fight against that to restore net neutrality. It's not as if Netflix, of course, and Google are doing this out of the goodness of their heart. That is enlightened self-interest, but in this case, they're actually on our side. So, hey, man, I welcome them on our side. In this case, having a big corporation behind you isn't always a bad idea. Now, however, when it comes to Leibowitz and his primary broadband client, well, it happens to be Comcast. Big corporation on his side happens to be one of the biggest beneficiaries of the net neutrality repeal. On his bio page, Leibowitz discloses that he has advised Comcast Corporation in connection with a number of regulatory matters and acquisitions. More broadly, Davis Polk was a key advisor in Comcast's purchase of NBCUniversal, as well as deals with DreamWorks and Time Warner Cable, which didn't end up being approved. Comcast has also used the New York-based law firm repeatedly, according to Reuters. And NBCUniversal's general counsel also came from the law firm of Davis Polk. So basically, here's a Comcast lawyer using the Wall Street Journal, which is a Rupert Murdoch publication, to give an unbiased opinion on why net neutrality represents no threat to consumers, even though we know the opposite. We know that it's a huge threat to consumers. We're going to have to end up paying more for the same kind of access. Now, net neutrality, again, has been repealed, and they're not going to do this automatically. Like, it's been a day. A week from now, they're not going to do this, but they're going to slowly roll things out, paid prioritization here, maybe not any mass blockings. But if they did, ironically, it would be more conservative sites that would be hit first. But I don't really want to get into that. But again, his talking points, well, sound a lot like the PR coming from Comcast. And that's what this article reflects. This is taking all of these industry talking points and putting them in a nice little editorial op-ed from a Democrat. See net neutrality, even Democrats hate net neutrality. Interesting. So here's a good example, right? Now, 2 days ago, senior Comcast executive David Cohen wrote, quote, "We have repeatedly stated and reiterate today that we do not and will not block, throttle, or discriminate against lawful content." So that's Comcast. They've had that message for a while. Notice that not too long ago, they had also promised not to do paid prioritization. They quietly dropped that promise because they're getting ready to do paid prioritization. So that is the so-called fast lanes that are actually disastrous for small business. Okay. Now, Leibowitz, in the same op-ed, stated, "Every major broadband provider has committed not to block, throttle, or unfairly discriminate against lawful content." All right, that sounds similar. But hey, look, maybe he's just taking them in context and repeating it. Here's another example. The order returns authority to the FTC to regulate data privacy and security for the entire internet ecosystem under a uniform federal technology-neutral framework, writes Cohen. Leibowitz writes, "The plan to restore FTC jurisdiction is good for consumers, because it puts the nation's foremost privacy cop back in the beat." So that's a similar talking point, but it's framed in a much more human way. Cohen also laments political grandstanding in, quote, "inaccurate cries of Armageddon, preventing policymakers from coming together to develop sensible, transparent, and durable open internet regulations." Leibowitz, however, he said that he is sad that the rhetoric over net neutrality has reached a fever pitch, and if everyone just set their partisanship aside, Congress could cement a meaningful and permanent resolution to an issue that should have been resolved a long time ago. Put simply, these are pretty much the exact same talking points, just worded differently to sound like an actual human being wrote them, and not a corporation. So the whole point is, so that we assume that this lawyer for Comcast just happens to use the exact same arguments, but only because he actually believes it. Now, let me ask you, do you believe that? Do you believe that this lawyer for Comcast just really, really believes that net neutrality, removing it, would actually be really, really good for consumers? And not at all great for the giant corporations that happen to pay him. Maybe. Or maybe there's something else going on. Now, one note here about the FTC. Again, this guy's former member of the FTC, the former chairman. So you would think he would know about the scope of the FTC's powers. Apparently he doesn't. Or actually, maybe he does, and this is exactly why he's cheering. Let me explain. The FTC might not actually be able to enforce the very things that he claims that they will be able to enforce. Interesting. ISPs will be put under an agency that in many cases might actually not be able to do anything to stop some of the more predatory practices by these ISPs. That's why the net neutrality rules were necessary in the first place. But again, Republicans are arguing, and even Democrats, which is what this guy is, are arguing, no. The FTC, it does a fine job. Well, the FTC, before 2015, was not doing a fine job, as there were actually a lot of issues with these companies trying to put their content first, Google trying to make their search engine faster by slowing everyone else down, etc., etc. So there are a lot of issues, right? But see, that's why net neutrality was necessary, and that's why we need it. However, Leibowitz, of course, he's got a record of going to bat for a lot of his clients. He had helped enable internet service providers, according to The Intercept, to sell personal data to marketing firms. That's your personal data going to a third party. And he also signed on a transition to report an he signed on to a transition report on antitrust law that recommended gutting key aspects of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Again, this man's a Democrat, which just basically proves that not all Democrats are progressive. He's a corporate Democrat, and he continues to prove that over and over again by sticking up for the corporate interests and not yours. And definitely not the consumer. So if you see an article or an op-ed by this guy, just know what you're dealing with. You should definitely have an idea what to expect, and it's going to be from a pro-corporate position. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.